pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
Оглядывайтесь, мы вас не добили под Сталинградом, на Украине, в Беларуси.
For which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible.
Против нас и будете опять готовить нападение, мы так ухнем.
Justice for all.
As we enter the conflict zone between the paradigms, the Anglo-American Empire will realize too late that they have been fighting the last war. This current paradigm was built on debt and death. The Anglo-American Empire won the last paradigm with its superior state capitalism, cranking out the most military hardware and leveling every other economic challenger. They then set about spreading debt all over the world to secure that position for the rest of the century. Ideas are more powerful than bombs, and this new war will be fought with real wealth and ideas. We will see that the war never stopped, and that they're close to winning.
Imagine to peer across the world and know the enemy's secrets, to place our thoughts into the minds of your leaders. Make your teachers teach the true version of history, your soldiers attack on our command. We will be everywhere at once, more powerful than a whisper, invading your dreams, picking your thoughts for you while you sleep. We will change you, Dr. Jones. All of you, from the inside. We will turn you into us. And the best part, you won't even know it's happening.
What good is the most powerful army in the world if the population that they seek to conquer is intellectually opposed to the repression and has very powerful nations backing them up? What good is the most powerful army in the world if their soldiers are tired of wars based on lies, and their paychecks bounce, and their pensions destroyed? What good is an economic system that has destroyed free market capitalism with state capitalism of fascism? What good is America if we've been systematically turned away from our Constitution and degenerated into socialistic, communistic wards of the state? What if the debts that we have incurred are now too large to defeat any enemy? What if the battle was already lost before the first bullet was fired? What if this was planned all along?
What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriot. Exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. So the next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, it doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation, what matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world, that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized." This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C.
In Vietnam, we had heard that we had to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese to win the war. This is true because if a populace does not willingly accept the power, they will cause too much trouble to keep that power. While the U.S. has successfully used bullets and bombs to force power onto other nations, we have been systematically destroyed from the inside with collectivist thought. So much so that our power elite have become full-fledged fascists, and the millions of those that depend on the state are full-fledged socialists. This vice between the top and bottom has purposely been done to destroy the American middle class that creates all the wealth in this country. With the Anglo-American Empire intellectually, economically, politically in shambles, the anti-hegemon simply has to follow the very successful model of empire that the West has used for centuries. Expand trade and business relationships, secure the resources through contracts or force, offer cover to nations that toe the line and consolidate power to the top. The anti-hegemon will be successful because they are offering peace and trade versus bullets and bombs, knowing all along that they're intellectually no different than the fascists that the Anglo-American Empire represents. How this conflict is ultimately resolved is yet to be determined. I have done videos about the Anglo-American Empire and how they could do 3 false flags to fail forward to try to extend their winning streak by starting a World War III.
I mean, how do you solve a problem where you're spending 10% of, you're running a 10% fiscal deficit? You're not going to get growth in the absence of private sector credit demand. So the government's idea right now is we're going to export our way out of this. And when I asked a senior member of the Obama administration last week, how are we going to grow exports if we won't allow nominal wage deflation? And he says, we're just going to kill the dollar. And I said, okay, more you mean.
Or we could wake up one day and the dollar totally destroyed because the world no longer wants to hold our dollar, and they'll embrace the new hegemon. One thing is certain, this way of life is done. And the only way to transfer your wealth from this way of life to the next one is through real assets like silver.
Let me begin by making just a thumbnail definition of the geopolitical context in which we all find ourselves, including America. And in my perspective, that geopolitical context is very much defined by two new global realities. The first is that global political leadership, by which I mean the role of certain leading powers in the world, has now become much more diversified, unlike what it was until relatively recently. Relatively recently still, the world was dominated by the Atlantic world, as it had been for many centuries. It no longer is. Today, the rise of the Far East has created a new, but much more differentiated global leadership. One which, in a nutshell, involves, if one can hazard, an arbitrary list of the primary players in the world scene: the United States, clearly, maybe next to it, but maybe the European Union. I say maybe because it is not yet a political entity. certainly increasingly so, and visibly so, China, Russia, mainly in one respect only, because it is a nuclear power co-equal to the United States, but otherwise very deficient in all of the major indices of what constitutes global power. Behind Russia, perhaps individually, but to a much lesser extent, Germany, France, Great Britain, Japan, certainly, although it does not have a politically assertive posture. India is rising. And then in the background of that, we have the new entity of G20, a much more diversified global leadership, lacking internal unity, with many of its members in bilateral antagonisms. That makes the context much more complicated.
While the criminals that sit at the top of the Anglo-American Empire and the anti-hegemon would love to have this new Hegelian dialectic between the two of them so that they could divide up the spoils of the world, there is one more power out there that they both fear more than each other, and that is a wide-awake humanity refusing to play along in this game anymore.
The other major change in international affairs is that for the first time in all of human history, mankind is politically awakened. That's a total new reality. Total new reality. It has not been so for most of human history until the last 100 years. And in the course of the last 100 years, the whole world has become politically awakened. And no matter where you go, politics is a matter of social engagement, and most people know what is generally going on in the world, and are consciously aware of global iniquities, inequalities, lack of respect, exploitation. Mankind is now politically awakened and stirring. The combination of the two, a diversified global leadership, politically awakened masses, makes a much more difficult context for any major power, including currently the leading world power, the United States. That for the first time in human history, for the first time in all of human history, almost all of mankind is politically awake. And these new and old major powers face still yet another novel reality, in some respects unprecedented. And it is that while the lethality of their power is greater than ever, their capacity to impose control over the politically awakened masses of the world is at a historical low. I once put it rather pungently, and I was flattered that the British Foreign Secretary repeated this, as follows. Namely, in earlier times, it was easier to control 1 million people, literally. It was easier to control 1 million people than physically to kill 1 million people. Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people. It is easier to kill than to control.